participants, all slides have been uploaded into the MyStats 2020 official portal for your reference. Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hello, yes. Can you hear me? They cannot hear. Okay, fine. So I think without further ado, okay, during the presentation, I would like to request for all the speakers to mute their mic. But I think at the same time, the Secretariat, can I ask for your cooperation to mute mics which cause the disturbance so that the speakers can present their findings smoothly. At the end of the session, I will just open for Q&A for 50 minutes. And for that, the participants can either type your questions or you can just raise your hand by clicking at the emoticon palm on the top right of your M team. So without further ado, can I just invite Mr. Suah Jianling to deliver his presentation. Thank you.
You guys can see my screen, yeah?
Yeah, you can see your screen.
Okay, first and foremost, thank you to DOSM especially for coming up with this initiative in forwarding research in statistics and also related fields, including economics, where most of my research is in. So this research is really about disentangling, the impact of uncertainty and exchange rate shocks on macroeconomic factors like output, prices, and interest rates at a global level. And in the research, what I do is that I also provide an additional focus on Malaysia and some of our immediate trade partners like ASEAN countries and the major economies. So there are two parts. First is the empirical section and also a theoretical component. The empirical component really is just to analyze, the data implied impact of uncertainty and exchange rate shocks, and the theoretical component then goes to try and propose to try and understand, how the transmission channel between uncertainty and output can arise, but from a macro behavioral frictions perspective. So this deviates from your classical economic assumptions, like where you have labor market frictions, pricing frictions, and all of these generate output fluctuations. What I propose then is to deviate from that. It could be just the fact that people are not rational and there are behavioral frictions in how they form expectations, and that affects the consumption and investment behavior in the economy at the individual level, and aggregate that together, you get your output fluctuations that perhaps could come to complement your classical understanding of the economy. So the motivation of this study really is an observation since the global financial crisis, right? There are two main observations here. The first is that output has been on a secular decline. Output growth has been on a secular decline across both advanced and emerging economies, and most prominently in emerging markets. Even if you exclude China, it is still the case. For advanced economies, it's not so obvious, but it does contrast the pre-GFC trend. And with COVID-19, output just completely collapsed. The second observation is that uncertainty has risen. This is measured with Davis 2016 economic news-based policy uncertainty index. It has been on an uptrend throughout the whole decade, and increasingly so it remained at historical highs, right? But unlike the trend you see in output, it's not so much a secular increase, but there are major risk events that they correspond to, like the trade war, the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, and recently COVID-19. And of course, US-China tensions, China-India tensions as well, and political unrest in advanced economies. So then all of these risk events on their own have an impact on output and the economy. But the bigger question then is, with the fact that uncertainty being at such an elevated state, or we live in a state in an era where uncertainty rises unexpectedly very frequently, could that in itself, on its own, have an impact on output, and that matters for welfare and macro policy. So just surveying the literature, there's pretty much near a consensus that uncertainty depresses output, and it does so in three ways, right? The first is that precautionary savings. When uncertainty rises, people behave more in a risk-averse manner and build up savings. and that deprives them of view of consumption and investment. Second is real options, that firms come to a decision paralysis because investment and employment decisions are irreversible and very costly. So when uncertainty rises, firms come to a decision paralysis and defer investment and employment decisions. And that in itself depresses output. Third is that could be seen as an aggregate demand shock, right? That uncertainty reduces the amount of economic information at hand. And individual firms and households treat that as a decline in economic activity and respond as such. And it itself feeds into even lower aggregate demand. So these are the three main underpinnings, right? And explaining the impact of uncertainty shocks on output. It's pretty much not so much ambiguity there. The dynamics of time dynamics may differ across countries, though. The debate findings on macro financial factors are a lot more ambiguous. It really depends on whether you're looking at advanced emerging economy or reserve currency economy. The responses on exchange rate and interest rates could differ. Moving on to exchange rate, right? There's pretty much documented. There are three big findings. Number one, there is a real effect on output and employment. Secondly, there seems to be distributional dimension. And really, thirdly, there are sectoral heterogeneity, sectoral differences. That the higher, this will be important explaining some of the results later, right? That some sort of a Penn-Balassa Samuelson effect, that higher productivity, low labor intensity manufacturing sectors, tradable sectors benefit from exchange rate depreciation. But it would in turn be harmful for the non-tradable sector, services sector, which is generally lower productivity, but higher employment, labor intensity. So the quality of jobs there and the matter, you may sometimes see an employment, may expect employment to increase in response to, in the services sector, response to exchange rate appreciation because of real income effects. But the net impact on the economy could be beneficial because the more productive manufacturing sector benefits, even though there are employment losses. So then the question is, which one matters for welfare, right? So that really sets the motivation for the paper. And I seek to answer two questions. Right? First, the empirics, what is the net uncertainty exchange rate and output nexus? And secondly, could macro behavioral frictions be part of this? Right? Not just the three main, the neo-Keynesian approach, where you have precautionary savings, real options, and aggregate demand channel being the main transmission channels. Macro behavioral frictions could be at hand as well, could be important as well. So the paper outlines actually the theoretical model in a lot more detail, but I'm omitting all of the math here just to focus on the intuition. There are five main ingredients. First, households and firms have time-varying risk preferences, such that the more risk averse, sometimes they're risk averse, sometimes they're not, and this determines how much they save and where they direct their savings into between your productive risk and unproductive hedge assets for simplicity. Risk assets are like your equities or productive investments. Unproductive hedge assets, you can think of them as bonds, for instance. Secondly, they're rationally inattentive, so they're forgetful. Think of this as it's costly to process long information from a long time ago. And so decisions and expectations are informed only by the immediate past. So your immediate past is of a very, there's an adverse shock that takes place, uncertainty rises or output collapses. That memory feeds into your expectation, and you have this downward bias or upward bias over your decision. So this creates some sort of self-fulfilling suboptimal equilibrium, right? Third is that households and firms have bounded expectations. How they form expectations first is that it's informed by immediate past, but secondly, it's also anchored by some nominal anchor, some anchor provided by a policymaker, in this case, a central bank. But the central bank's best guess, precision of this best guess is dislodged, and when it's dislodged during times of uncertainty, the households and firms' expectations deviate back to their own formation, their own expectations, which could be biased. So a good documentation out there that household inflation expectations they display an upward bias. So it may not be surprising then to see inflation expectations shoot up or realized inflation shoot up during times of uncertainty. even as demand collapses. So the fourth ingredient is that policymakers are cognitively limited. This really reflects that there's delay in macro data releases, and there's no way for the central bankers and not market participants to know precisely what's going on in the economy at that time. So their guesses are the best guess of macro aggregates. That's not to say households and firms know the whole economy. They know their own prices and output, but not for the whole economy. So to get a form and expectation on the aggregate, they still rely on the central bank's best guess. Fifth is that they're loss averse, right? This comes from standard macro assumptions. So this is what generates the mechanism in which policymakers respond aggressively when uncertainty rises. So it really approximates for what actually happened in the first half of the year, where if a great uncertainty, no one knows what actually happened to the economy, the severity, but the immediate response is to react very aggressively and very swiftly. Right? So this chart here really just shows how agents deviate from the official from their anchor towards their own expectations. The paper actually delves a bit more on how the math of how this works. The intuition is that when uncertainty rises, the reliance on the anchor is eroded, and they move back to their own expectations, which could be biased. Right? So this means a few things for policy, right? Central banks can target the close the information gap to try and reduce the influence of uncertainty on the reliance on the so-called best guess. And to do this perhaps is to provide alternate anchors. A lot of central banks have been doing this as well, to provide high frequency data as an anchor, or to actually build their own new databases. I think this is what the Bank of England has done as well, with the panel of their own firm level data set of purchasing managers. I think it's their own PMI. So these are some of the main policy implications, right? There's a scope to target these behavioral frictions. So to then empirically analyze the question, right? I built two sets of macro data. First one is monthly data set covering a good chunk of the global economy. The variables here are selected from standard macro literature actually. And for countries with their own uncertainty indices, I use that. Otherwise, I use the global indices. These are mostly small open economies. Second data set focuses on Malaysia, and it's constructed in such a way that Malaysian variables do not feed into global variables. But this is done in the empirical model, not at the data construction stage.
Mr. Suah, you have another 5 minutes left.
Yep, thank you. So I took five. Actually, so I took there are five empirical approaches I took, but really two parts. The first three, these are your structural time series models. The last two are just for statistical inference. There's no causal inference or any structural inference here. It's just what the data tells you. Right? We use this to see if there are nonlinearities or distributional dimensions are implied by the data. Right. So to focus on Malaysia, I use a max uncertainty. So it's the maximum uncertainty vector autoregression, MUVA. First introduced in Jackson, actually, St. Louis Federal Reserve. Yeah. What they did was it's a standard VAR, except you add another term, this Z hat here, where you create where you allow a possibility that there could be additional jump effect when uncertainty rises far above its historical norm, right? Immediate compared to the historical immediate past year. So from there, I estimated the IRFs of Shulsky decomposition, lower triangle decomposition, and the findings are not controversial, really. In response to uncertainty shock, output depresses, the inflation deviates from. There's a shortfall in inflation from its steady state. So persistent decline in employment. So some evidence of flight to safety, both between and within country. And obviously, since we use a global policy uncertainty index, global output falls as well in a similar trend. Exchange rate responses to exchange rate appreciation shocks are a bit more. It shows some compositional effect that I talked about earlier. That output depresses but employment rises. How could this be the case, right? It could be the case that a services sector benefits, and so employment rises in that sector. But because it's low productivity, the output gains from the manufacturing sector actually improves. Sorry, so the output losses from the manufacturing sector actually dominates, even though the employment losses from the manufacturing sector is dominated by the employment gains in the services sector. Yeah, so that's really one main controversy there. And bring this to a panel VAR setting. Again, similar findings, not too different from the Malaysian case. Likewise, your exchange rate responses as well. So what this really says is that even the responses are quite universal, right? It's not just to Malaysia. And in the literature, normally this sort of research, this sort of empirical analysis is done on a small panel or a specific country, maybe like the US or Eurozone, Japan. Not insofar as covering a wide range of economies. And what I find here then is that, well, this intuition you have been informed of for the US major economies seem to apply quite universally as well. Then bring this to a panel hierarchical model, which allows us to extract the specific country level, country specific IRFs, showing only a few countries here and only for response of output, right? The response output falls in response to uncertainty shock, but the correction is only seen in the US, which was well documented, but not in other countries. Right? So it's one area which we shed light on compared to the existing empirical literature. Exchange rate response to exchange rate shocks is a bit more heterogeneous. Again, it could be reflective of compositional effects, different services versus manufacturing composition. Then to the data implied analysis, right, I will use a lasso model to see if there are any non-linearities. Not so much really, except for the relationship between exchange rate yields and output, right? So this could be one scope for later research. Quantile regression to see if there are distributional effects. Maybe, but they are broadly imprecisely estimated. So it's hard to say from the data alone. So there are two contributions here, conceptual model, which focuses on macro behavioral friction, and then a broad global level analysis in a panel setting. What's next, right? Maybe a quantitative setting, which can capture some non-linearity and policy inference that VAR models cannot do. So DSG or type models could be the way forward on neural network models. The second thing I expect as conjecture is that the macro level measures are off. The macro level measures can be quite noisy. So moving to more granular data for these macro concepts that could allow us more precise inference in the future. So thank you. That's actually the end of my paper. If any questions, feel free to contact me at this email over here. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Suah, for your presentation. It's good that you have already shared with us your email address, given that the time is quite constrained, given to you like 15 minutes. So I just want to echo what Mr. Suah just now said, that if there are any questions, then it's either you post it at the end of the session or later when you have, since you have the email address, then you can just contact Dr. Suah directly.
I don't have a PhD, so don't call me doctor, please.
Sorry, I said Mr. Suah. I'm so sorry. Okay,
right,
Mr. Suah. Thanks a lot. So next, I would like to invite Ms. Ree-Ann to present your findings.
Thank you.
Over to you. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are well. Today, me, Dr. Maryam Yousefi Nejad, with collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Nabila Rozani and Ms. Nur Hafiza Roslan. We are from Management and Science University, MSU. We would like to present our finding under the topic of causal relationship between International Financial Reporting Standard, IFRS, and Foreign Direct Investment, FDI. We are looking on ASEAN countries. Our research design is panel data on 10 ASEAN countries. So actually in this research, we are looking on the importance of economic growth for all countries around the world nowadays. Most of the important goal of almost every countries in the world is increase their economic growth. So one of the way that based off the papers, based off all the work researchers find that can increase the level of economic growth for all the countries, especially developing countries, is increase in the level of foreign direct investment. Why? Because actually foreign direct investment can bring high employment, transfer managerial skills, and also technology. That's why it leads to increase the level of economic growth. As you can see in this information that I presented with this slide, that the information was obtained from World Bank database from 1995 until 2016. As you can see in the pie chart, total FDI flow of developing countries are 50% with including ASEAN countries, and also 47% is for developed country and 3% is for only economic in transition. Why only these three classification? Because World Investment Report already classify and category all the countries under this category: developed, developing, and economic in transition. As you can see, we have in the pie chart I already mentioned that a percentage. There is a dramatic increase in FDI inflow of developing countries, especially from 1995 until 2016. As you can see, especially we can see this impressive change from 2000 until 2016. That is
Maryam, sorry,
yeah.
Dr. Maryam, sorry. I think your slides are not being shown at the right page.
Excuse
Because
me?
because your slides is not at the right page actually, I think. Because we are currently see the front page, the cover page of your slide.
Oh, I don't know.
Yes. Can you turn into slideshow?
Okay. Actually, I'm in the slideshow. So now it's titled. This is the slide
Okay.
that I'm explaining.
All right. So now we are on the right page. Thank you. Yeah, you can continue. Yeah.
Okay. So now, as you can see, there is a dramatic increase on FDI inflows of developing countries. That is 42% of total world's FDI inflow in 2000 to 2016. This impressive FDI growth in developing countries, that is 190% from 2000 until 2016, is not observed in other groups, as you can see. As the group's rate for developed countries for the same period of time is only 23%. So, moreover, FDI inflow are increasing in some region in the world. However, the greatest growth is received by the associate of Southeast Asian nation or ASEAN region. So, as again in pie chart demonstrate the total FDI inflow for ASEAN or 4% only for 10 countries. And also additionally, there is a dramatic increase. Let me to share my tables. Here, as you can see, we have a dramatic increase in FDI of ASEAN countries from almost 21 USD dollar billion USD dollar. That is 1% of total FDI in 2000. From here on to 128 billion USD dollar, 5% of total world world FDI inflow in 2016. That is an increase of 505%. That is, this high growth made ASEAN countries a great opportunity for researchers to explore FDI determinants. So one of the policies ASEAN countries, as you can see in this line chart again, maybe they increase their quality of information. So we accept or adopt international financial reporting standards. We faced with 3 milestones, as you can see with the yellow line here, in terms of IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standard. That International Financial Reporting Standard is introduced by International Accounting Standard Board at 2000. So as you can see, we have increased in 2000 in FDI inflows. And after that, the second milestone in 2005, that most of the European countries adopt IFRS, start to compliance with IFRS in 2005. So as you can see, we have an increase in FDI. And after that, we have a third milestone that is relevant most in developing countries in 2010, that most of the ASEAN countries adopt IFRS and start compliance with IFRS from 2010. As you can see, after 2010, we have increasing in FDI. So that's why we can mention that, okay, maybe IFRS can be one of the main reason. That's why we have this impressive increase in FDI rate in ASEAN countries by 505% increase. But it's very important for us to make sure how IFRS can affect on FDI. Actually, IFRS, based on previous research show us that IFRS help to increase the transparency, increase the comparability. So with these two concepts, actually information cost, processing cost, collect information, analyze the information is become cheaper, the information cost reduce. So when the information cost reduce, of course, the two parties, investors and also companies, doesn't have any information asymmetry between them. So when they have the same level of information, of course, they can make better economic decision making. So when they can have a better economic decision making, of course, foreign direct investment can be increased. So that's why we suppose that IFRS can affect positively on FDI. So we mentioned ASEAN region has seen tremendous growth in terms of FDI, and also we find IFRS leads higher transparency, less information cost related to FDI. Hence, IFRS implementation might be an important reason for FDI growth in ASEAN countries. However, ASEAN countries, we have 10 countries. However, 2 countries that receive high FDI inflows, which are Indonesia and Vietnam, they have not implemented IFRS yet. So is it true that really IFRS leads to higher transparency and improve information reset, asymmetry level, then encourage more inflow of FDI? So this is our problem statements. So based on previous study, we have very limited study in terms of those studies that examine economic consequence of IFRS, especially in developing countries. And also very few studies we find them. Therefore, this study aims to fill the gap by focusing on IFRS adoption and FDI in associate of Southeast Asian nation. And those studies that they are available also show those limited study. Those also shows shows mixed results. Some of them show positive, some of them show no effect. So that's why it's very good opportunity. Other things that are very important for our study is indigeneity problem between IFRS and FDI. It means that maybe at the same time that IFRS can affect on FDI enhancement, also those studies that find, okay, those studies that adopt IFRS and now faced with increasing in foreign direct investment, so they encourage to adopt IFRS because they found, okay, maybe if they adopt IFRS, they can increase their economic growth. So that's why it's also very important.
Dr. Maryam, can you move to slides number 6, because I think your presentation is referring to slides number 6, and you have 5 minutes left, because your slides is not moving.
I don't know what's the problem that I cannot. Yeah.
Okay, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay. So that's why other gap is a panel co-integration and dynamic ordinary least square that we are focus on that. There is no study in this area that use dynamic effects. So for dynamic, we have some diagnostic we have these two research models. That for the research model first, I use different measurement for international financial reporting standard, and as you can see, RDV is FDI, and IV, the main IV is IFRS, and we have some economic variables that past study shows that have a strong effect on FDI. So with panel co-integration, we can cover indigeneity problem, and also very suitable for a small sample, and also we can find long run and short run relationship between variables. But we have to run two diagnostic tests, panel unit root test and panel co-integration test. The first one, panel unit root test, we use Levin, Lian, and Cho LLC and IPS for testing panel unit root test. And based on our test, this is the results. We find that all the variable at level, they are not stationary, and at the first they are stationary. So we can find that we are at the first generation test, so we can proceed with the next, that is panel co-integration test. For panel co-integration test, we have 4 statistic tests, and we have to find most of them significant. If we find most of them are significant, we can proceed with panel co-integration dynamic ordinary least square. As you can see, we have 4 significant results, so we can proceed with those. Results of those show us that yes, IFRS has a positive effect on FDI on 10% significance. This is partially significant, and also GDP has a significant result. And model 2 that we use, IFRS level of compliance, also we find same result, and very interesting, the effect of education on FDI enhancement here. So panel causality test is the next test that actually it was very important, because we can test with panel causality test, we can find short run and long run relationship between variables. At the same time, we change the place of dependent variable and IV. At the first, our IV is IFRS and DV is FDI. And we repeat it with IFRS as a DV and FDI as the IV. So with this relationship, we can find the short run and long run. What is the meaning? Short run, it means that when IV change, immediately DV is changed. And long run, it means that it takes time, maybe 5 years, to have the changes. As you can see, both short run and long run, we find the positive relationship and significant relationship between IFRS and FDI. That is very good results. So we find, yes, IFRS can affect FDI. So the conclusion is, this study showed that IFRS adoption attract more foreign investments into a country. This result that the level of in compliance with IFRS is an important driver for foreign investor. Even for Indonesia, which had not adopted IFRS but is taking a step to comply with IFRS. So the contribution beside methodological contribution, as discussed before, findings of this study could be useful for countries which are IFRS adopter to understand the economic consequence of IFRS, and also non-adopter such as Vietnam and Indonesia, that they find, okay, the useful input of IFRS adoption. So they encourage to, if they want to increase their economic growth and FDI level, so they can encourage to adopt and compliance and put some steps toward IFRS adoption. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Maryam, for your presentation. I think it's beneficial, and it's very useful for us to understand the impact of the adoption of IFRS to the FDI as per your research. I think Ms. Lim has connection problem with the internet, I think. So based on the communication that I had with the Secretariat, we will play her video, which was being recorded earlier. So basically, Dr. Maryam,
if you have any question, you can email me by this email that you can see in this screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Maryam, for sharing your email address.
Thank you so much.
Secretariat, maybe we can just display video of Ms. Lim's presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, professors, doctors, and everyone. Before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for attending this session. In the next 10 minutes, I'll present on my master research project, which is titled Access to Alternative Financing Sources among Small and Medium Enterprises in Malaysia. First, I'll walk you through the study background and research motivations. After that, I will explain on the methodology before presenting the results. Finally, I'll present the discussion and conclusions before ending the session. Now let's begin. Ensuring SME can get the financing they require for their business is important due to their significant contribution to the country's economy. In Malaysia, SME outnumber large firms in terms of the total number of companies and also the overall employment offered. In the past, SME in Malaysia have relied heavily on traditional bank loans. With the development of alternative finance, they now have more platforms or channels to get the fund they need. As of today, there is no universal definition for alternative finance. To address this issue, the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance from the UK have proposed a taxonomy to describe 9 broad categories of non-traditional forms of financing, with models ranging from P2P lending, invoice trading, crowdfunding, and so on. It has been noted that information asymmetry is a barrier for successful alternative financing. This is due to the fact that on models like the peer-to-peer lending or crowdfunding, usually the lenders only have access to the information disclosed by the prospective borrowers. As a matter of fact, many alternative financing models have a mechanism to mitigate such information asymmetry. For instance, usually on P2P platforms, they have bespoke risk model to calculate the credit ratings of the borrower from a set of information. In these cases, usually 2 types of information are required. The first being the hard information. We can include the credit history, income level of the borrower, and other quantifiable, measurable, and verifiable information. The second type is the soft information, which include personal information or demographic characteristic about the borrower. The consensus is that both types of information are valuable inputs, with past evidence showing that the lenders are able to make use of both hard and soft information in their lending decision-making on P2P platforms. The importance of hard information in predicting successful alternative funding is well established by the literature. Specifically, borrowers with higher or better credit ratings are more likely than their counterparts to get fully funded. However, there has been inconsistency in evidence regarding the demographic characteristic of the borrower. For instance, Pope and colleagues found that being older, males, and African Americans are less likely of being fully funded on P2P platform based in the US. On the other hand, Wen et al. 2017 found the otherwise using P2P transaction data from China. Given this, a better understanding of how demographic characteristics of the borrower as sources of soft information in the context of alternative finance is important. Recent years have witnessed the substantial uptake of alternative finance by SME. Still, there is limited work focusing on SME borrowers. More importantly, firm characteristics have never been utilized as sources of soft information in this context. A qualitative study by Phantom 2016 concludes that firm size, business stage, and type of management actually influence SME choice of alternative financing. Therefore, This paper seeks to investigate the impacts of owner characteristic and firm characteristic on access to alternative finance among SME in Malaysia. In this part, I'll present on the methodology. This study used secondary survey data, and the initial sample consisted of 150 SME located in Kelantan. This sample was based on the current definition of SME in Malaysia, and they were recruited via convenience sampling. From this data set, a subsample was extracted consisting of those who have applied for alternative finance for their business in the past. Based on the definition that I briefly presented earlier, the outcome variable was the firm's application status for any of the following alternative financing sources. That is, invoice trading, P2P lending, crowdfunding, or debt-based security. In our paper, an SME is said to have no access to alternative finance if its application was unsuccessful, and the vice versa. There are 10 predictors in total. And here are the list of variables used and its description. To meet our research objective, the purposeful selection logistic regression described by Bursack et al. 2008 was applied using SPSS version 25. The reason we chose this approach is because of its ability to retain important confounding variables while identifying significant predictors. Next, we will look at the descriptive result of the sample. As you can see, about 76% were successful in their applications. Looking at the results of logistic regression, ownership and business stage have emerged as significant predictors in the final model, both of which are related to firm characteristics. First, the odds of SME operate as limited partnership being successful in their application were about 6.4 times greater than those operate as sole trader. Secondly, SME operate as proprietary Sendirian Berhad companies were 20.3 times more likely to be successful in their application than those who operate as sole trader. Third, the odds of SME who are in the growth phase being successful in their application were about 12.5 times greater than those who are in the birth phase. In this part, we'll look at the discussion and conclusions. The current findings demonstrate the importance of firm characteristics in explaining Malaysian SMEs' access to alternative finance and extend on the current understanding of how firm characteristics can be utilized as sources of source information. In Malaysia, Sendirian Berhad companies are subjected to regulation and business compliance. It is likely that the supply side of alternative finance perceives this as indicator for credibility and formality of operation, which further strengthens the perceived creditworthiness of these SME borrowers. Furthermore, the lenders may perceive SME who are focusing on increasing their sales and business growth as having attractive investment opportunity that can maximize their profits. Given our result, a recommendation for SME owners managers is to focus on growing their sales by developing new projects or innovation. By marketing their business as having room for growth, SME in Malaysia would do well in accessing alternative finance. Nevertheless, there are a number of limitations that should be considered when interpreting our results. First, our finding might not be generalized beyond this research due to the small sample size that was not randomly selected, which will essentially result in large standard errors. Secondly, due to the use of secondary data, for SME having multiple owners, it was unclear whose responses were recorded. It is therefore important for future work to clarify these issues and investigate if our findings are consistent across different settings or different alternative financing model. That's it for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Miss Lim. Even though we actually play the video of Miss Lim, but Miss Lim is still with us. So I'll just open a Q&A session for 10 minutes. So anybody can just raise your hand so that I can just call your name. Okay, maybe I just want to pose one question to Dr. Maryam. On slides 20, that you explained to us the results of your study that show the IFRS adoption attracts more foreign investment into a country. Based on your study, whether there's any other factors that counter this effect, as in by right it should be both in that line, but it gives you a different direction.
Okay, it means that, sorry, which slides you want to focus on? Which slides?
Slide 20 of Dr. Maryam.
Yeah, yes. Which slides?
Sorry?
Sorry, you ask me now the question from which slides?
Slides number 20.
Okay, 20.
Yeah, because based on your study, you were saying that IFRS adoption gives advantage to to basically affect the FDI level of a country. So my question would be, based on your study, whether there's any factors that counter your findings.
Yes, of course. As you can, as I explained in causal relationship, also we have other factors such as GDP, exchange rate, and education. And also we expand this research by governance effectiveness, and also stability policy stability of the countries also can affect on the relationship between IFRS and FDI. Actually, but in this study, we are more focused on economic consequence of IFRS. That's why we highlight IFRS.
All right, understood.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Any questions from the floor?
Hi, Suah here. I do have a question.
Yeah, proceed.
Yeah. So in your so this is also directed to Maryam. In your paper, FDI is included in levels, right? So I was wondering if it would matter if you scale it by, say, GDP or total investment, or some sort of some sort of measure that reflects the size of the economy at hand. And the second part of that is because your paper claims causality. So I'm wondering if the characteristics of the economy is concerned, like institutional quality, all these could be co-integrated in a way, determine how fast IFRS is adopted, and that in itself perhaps could be what's driving the FDI flows. So I was wondering, like, if there are any, if it was a concern that you thought of as well.
Actually, we didn't test how many years it takes time to affect to be find this sensitivity between IFRS and FDI. But actually, as you know, a causality test that show us the short run and long run relationship. In both, when we have when IV is IFRS, we find significant relationship between them in short run. And when IFRS be as a DV, it means that, for example, some countries find, for example, in ASEAN countries find Malaysia, after adopting IFRS, they face with more economic growth, so they encourage to adopt IFRS. That's why we replace the place with IV and DV. So now our DV is IFRS. So in this relationship, we find the long run relationship between FDI and IFRS at 5% significancy. It means that, of course, IFRS can have effect on FDI, but maybe time takes time, maybe more than 2 years or 3 years to find the positive effect of IFRS or positive effect, economic effect of IFRS on FDI or economic growth. But actually, we didn't test how many years exactly takes times. But with statistic information, we can find, okay, for example, after how many years we find increase in the in FDI inflows or some or GDP as well. I don't know, I can answer your question or not.
My concern was actually more of, if you control for other determinants that could drive FDI flows, like one immediate point that I can think of is institutional quality or political stability or things like that. And if these factors also determine IFRS take-up, then it may be more difficult to interpret the DOLS findings as that IFRS drives results in FDI flows.
Okay, of course, we are not looking at, we are not mentioned only IFRS is a determinant factor for FDI. Of course, we are not. Actually, we proceed with this paper and we add some other factors such as information asymmetry and find, okay, now we suppose that IFRS because increase the quality of information, increase the comparability. So that's why reduce information asymmetry, that's why affect on FDI. So we test, is there any relationship between information asymmetry and FDI or not? But we find yes, also significant relationship. Of course, we have a lots of factors that can affect, but because we are in accounting, so that's why we are focusing on international financial reporting standard more rather than of other factors. But I agree with you that if we add more variables, might be difficult to conclude that only or IFRS is the most important factors that can affect on FDI.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
I
think CPS
Suah,
has a.
there's one question for you, Suah. Yeah.
Yep. Actually, let me share my screens because findings. Right. So I think you're referring to the max uncertainty VaR findings specifically for Malaysia. So could you elaborate more on the reaction of shocks to the shocks and uncertainty? Right. Okay. So the VaR actually estimates how the VaR works is that we estimate this equation and then use Shulsky decomposition to extract some structural IRFs. How you read this is that when uncertainty, the policy uncertainty index, news-based policy uncertainty index at a global level increases by about 1 standard deviation. I think that's about 80 something points. So that's really equivalent to an increase in uncertainty during the trade war, but obviously subsequently increased more than that. Output growth falls below its steady state. So think of it as a trend growth that Malaysia is on. It could be somewhere around 3 to 4% or 5%. It's modeled implied by the data, and it falls from that steady state by about 0.5 percentage points over a horizon of 4 to 8 quarters before correcting itself. So it fully corrects back to its steady state after 12 quarters here. Like you can think of this as the three main channels here. It could be households and firms building up precautionary savings, or firms entering a decision paralysis. That's something that the news will also say that firms actually delay their investments or plant expansion, or end up closing plants as well in some GVC countries. So this could be some of the channels that's driving the output collapse. Similar for employment as well. So it's just firms being forced to cut output and subsequently responding as such by reducing manpower. On the in terms of to the exchange rate shock, the response to the exchange rate really is just that you see a divergence in output growth. So output, when the exchange rate appreciates by the trade-weighted nominal exchange rate appreciates by 1 standard deviation, output actually falls by around 0.1. So there's a small but noticeable collapse in output relative to its steady state, but a gain in employment. So what I conjectured this to be is that the services sector, the more labor-intensive sector, gains from the appreciation effect, such that imports are now cheaper. So for those employed in the non-tradable sector, it's akin to a real income gain. So employment, there's an increase in demand, increase in that sector. So employment increases. Versus the manufacturing sector, which is more productive, they lose out. So it could be the case that the output losses in the manufacturing sector outweighs that of the services sector. But they are less labor intensive, so the employment losses are dominated by the services sector here. So these are just 2 ways, one of the ways to interpret the findings here. I'm not sure if I addressed your question precisely.
Nurliza, do you have any more questions after listening to Suah's explanation?
Okay, right. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Suah. Do we have any questions from the floor? Okay, so I think that's the end of the session. So I would like to thank all the attendees and speakers. Suah and Dr. Maryam has shared with you the email address. Then maybe after this, if there are any more questions, you can just contact them directly. For us to conclude the session, then maybe I can just request the speakers to turn on your video so that your camera, so that we can just have a group photo. Dr. Maryam, Suah, and Ms. Lim.
Okay, I would like to invite my co-authors as well, Nur Hafiza Roslan and Dr. Nabila. Please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maryam.